Are there any particular problems that would need to be dealt with in these later stage utopias if we just lived forever?
Well, I mean, the most obvious one would be the size of the population, which is able to increase exponentially. If nobody dies, then at some point the rate of births would have to match the rate of acquisition of new resources in order to maintain high per capita incomes. Because at technological maturity, there wouldn't be increases in productivity. Like, that's one of the things that drive technological growth now, right? Even if the resources are the same, you could have better technologies to make more efficient use of them, but that will have maxed out. And so then the only way that the economy could grow at that point is if more resources are attained through expanding in space. But that can at most happen at a polynomial rate, like you have a bubble that is growing in all directions at some significant fraction of the speed of light, and the volume of that grows as a polynomial of time, whereas the population could grow exponentially, right? And so then eventually you would have a Malthusian condition. And so in the limit, you would need to sort of make sure the rate of population increase, which might be sort of digital minds making copies of themselves, right? That would kind of at most match the rate at which the resource endowment increases. Like another maybe more philosophically interesting question, if we eliminated aging, and then, I mean, right now what would happen if you eliminated aging is that people would die from accidents and wars, but maybe with a lifespan of a few thousand years, if you kind of calculate the rate of death by accident. Now, hopefully, we will bring down the rate of accidents and war. Certainly in utopia, you'd imagine that to go way down. And if you could upload yourself to computers, then you could make backup copies and stuff, and then the rate of accidents could kind of become arbitrarily small. So then you might have very long lifespans, even astronomical, and that presents more interesting philosophical questions for human values. In that, well, first of all, we don't know what would happen to, like, if you remained a human mind of like a brain with your current size and the number of synapses and stuff. Like, we know you can continue to learn and develop and grow for like 100 years, but we don't even know what would happen if a human just kept living for 400 years. Like, would you go stale and rigid and like, and even if that didn't happen in a sort of, like neurological way, like, then it might still be that, and it's a hard question to sort of gauge, but that the number of different types of things that can be done with a human mind and body in a human world is finite, and is that number is small enough that it would become relevant, so that at some point you would just run out of interesting new things to do. And if so, how long? Like, I mean, I think given that we are finite, there has to be some number of years after which you would literally be doing the same thing you'd already done. But if that is kind of 10 to the power of 100 or something, we might not have to care very much, because we die anyway before that from the heat death of the universe. But if the answer is like 10,000 years, like after 10,000 years, you'd basically just repeat yourself, then either you'd have to accept that such lives will have a diminution of a certain kind of novelty, and that may be a price to admittance in this kind of extreme longevity in utopia, or you would have to perhaps start to level up after you have spent 10,000 years being a human. Maybe then you would want to become a transhuman, like increase your intellectual faculties or something, and you could kind of start to tackle the next level of challenges and keep developing that way. But it is, I think it is one direction in which you can kind of take our current human values and where they start to become strained. If you just imagine the current human lifespan with our current values and our current faculties, but just extended and like prevented from physical disease. Like, at some point, I think that would possibly become unattractive. Like, there are still a lot of things in human life that don't require novelty. I mean, like a cup of tea is like about as good like the 10,000th time as it is the second time or first time, right? they're like renewable pleasures. And sometimes you could run the argument that sometimes the best things in life are the little things, that it's not like the big dramatic narrative climaxes, but it's like, the smell of autumn air in the evening along a stroll along the coast, or like looking into your loved one's face, or a little, a cup of tea or whatever, like these little things. Sometimes, you could run the argument that that's a fairly high quality value, although we give them kind of short shrift.
An interesting connection to the philosophical literature going back hundreds of years, is how conceptions of personal identity might shift in this world where we live indefinitely. I think, and you should correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Locke who proposed that personal identity has something to do with memory and psychological connectedness, and maybe it was Derek Parfit in his sort of ongoing discourse with David Lewis, who questioned whether somebody who wasn't immortal would eventually no longer be the same person that they started out as, because they would not remember, let's say, their childhood. There would no longer be any psychological connection to a person stage thousands and thousands of years earlier. And in this sort of utopia, maybe we would bypass this by getting memory implants or memory chip implants, so that we could just continually add new memories and maintain internal psychological connectedness.
Yeah. I guess there is, first of all, like, I would want to retain the distinction between long time and infinity. Like, immortality, I think, should mean not dying, not just taking a while before you die, like conceptually. And it is important because immortality in that strict sense just might be impossible in our physical universe, and be the preserve of, say, more theological scenarios. And from the view of eternity, like whether you live for like 80 years or 80,000 years, it's kind of in some sense the same, right? It's an infinitesimal short relative to infinity either way. Now, I do think that, yes, increasing, I call it time suits, but the idea that we could make some modifications to us that make us better able to survive radical change without having our identity eroded or our values corrupted. So the most obvious thing would be to improve our episodic memory, so that you actually don't just forget what you've been through. And that could make you sort of remain relevantly the same for longer than if you just have like the memory of a goldfish. And you could imagine some other tricks as well that would allow us to sort of endure for longer periods of time. And upgrading our capacities in different ways could help with that. But even if it came to a point where you would have to accept some loss of personal continuity in whatever relevant sense, I mean, it might be acceptable. Like if you have a 5-year-old and you know that if there were a pill that would just arrest their development, that they would remain a 5-year-old. Like in some sense, maybe a year from now, that would be more similar to what they're now than if they're just allowed to freely develop. But we might still think it's better for them to grow up. Like, in some sense, you're the same person now as you were when you were 5, but realistically, you're also quite different, right, in many ways. And maybe that's not an unambiguously bad thing. Like, and so I think the combination of these, we can reduce the negative effects of various kinds of corroding consequences of the passage of time through improving memory and certain other positive attributes, and like also including like maybe extending your planning horizon, etc., and then also accepting some degree of change, even if it does mean that you eventually move further away from what you once were. There's still a difference between that and just dying, because at any given point in time, you might look forward to hundreds of years of existing in some very similar thing to your current condition, and you would gradually sort of, see new ways of doing things or being, or new experiences. That feels a lot more optimistic to me than like a kind of, you're going to be shot tomorrow morning, right? It's this smoother and gentler way of losing our connection with the past seems perhaps prudentially preferable, even to the extent that it is unavoidable relative to the alternative.